Welcome back. This is the Finance Forum. I'm Abdu-Raof Hanslo, and in this second segment of the program, we're sitting with now a very good friend of mine, Mr. Johan Els, the senior economist at the Old Mutual Investment Group, and the Old Mutual Group, obviously, that manages the Islamic funds called the Al Baraka Islamic Funds, the longest running Islamic funds in South Africa. Johan, during the break, we had a lot to talk about. And I think to start this off, in the second segment, what we'd like to do is to look at the impacts the consumer could basically expect in everyday life. But before we enter that, is to maybe just look at the volatility of the rand over the last while, as well as maybe just give us a short, if possible, a short prediction of where we expect the rand to be. I know there's a lot of scenarios that depends on a lot of scenarios, but I think we have more or less a feel of where the currency is.
Yes. So when South Africa, in the first half of this year, running towards June and the possible ratings downgrade by S&P, the rand was very weak and very volatile. And then S&P did not downgrade us, which was a surprise to the markets really. And the rand then entered a period of more stability, and eventually just after the local government elections, quite strong, around 13 odd against the dollar. So quite a bit more strength coming through over the last few months. And that's not unusual because we've seen fundamentals improving, and also after Brexit vote in the UK, we've seen that impact on emerging markets, that foreign investors are willing to invest in emerging markets again, realizing better returns, better growth than developed markets. That helped the rand. And of course this latest volatility around uncertainty about the Minister of Finance, and all around that, I mean, the rand could potentially be very volatile. And I don't know where the rand will go if the Minister of Finance is removed, for instance, or if we are downgraded to junk status by the ratings agencies. But it's not impossible that it can be extreme. But whenever the rand moves to extreme levels, whether that's on the strong side or on the weak side, the rand tends to come back. It tends to correct. So I don't know whether the rand at the end of the year, let's say we are downgraded, goes to 16 or 17. But we've been there late last year, early this year. So I don't think that it'll be a huge shock. It'll be weaker than where it is now. And then maybe it has been priced in the markets, or to a large extent. So maybe the rand doesn't move to 17, it moves to 15 if we downgrade it. And then if we're not downgraded, then maybe we go to 13 or 12.50. So what I'm trying to tell you, there's so much uncertainty on either side over the next few months that to make a 5-year investment decision, like we should, ideally, if we're rational human beings, but we're not always rational, you shouldn't base it on a short-term outlook. And really, I know the feeling back in the office as well when we sit and we see these moves in the currency from minute to minute. It's tense, but we have to try and look through that into a slightly longer term. And I know it's difficult, but
and you know, you mentioned about Brexit, and that just alluded to one topic. But before we get to that, over the weekend I read an article, Johan, and that article alluded to the rand possibly hitting the 16, 17, 18, or even 19 rand to the US dollar, which is fairly bad news for us as consumers. The probability surrounding that?
I think it's not impossible. For us, in terms of the impact on consumers, impact on inflation, petrol prices, all of those, that is only if the rand sustains those levels. So if the rand moves to 19, let's say, or even 20, but it stays there for a year, 2 years, that's dangerous. If the rand goes to 19 and a few weeks later it's back at 16 or 15, that's not so bad. It's part of the volatility that we've become accustomed to. So it's the sustainability. Even if the rand moves to 12, is it staying there or not? That's important. If it moves to 20, is it staying there or not? I think it's a fairly low probability, the way we at Old Mutual look at the scenarios unfolding. I think the rand wouldn't blow out significantly, more than about 15 or 16. I think if it moves to 20, that only tells me beginning of next year it's back at 15. The more extreme the move is, the more I expect it to come back.
You know, and alluding to that as well, is recently we've seen in the BRICS sector, we've seen an exit of a president being taken out of office. And we've seen the impacts thereof as well. And it throws me back to where we are at the moment, and we have to face the facts that there is a high probability, or not a high probability, there is a probability that a South African president might be removed from office. And that impact is obviously negated by whether it was a good president or a bad president. But in our case, what would the implications be at this stage if the South African president is removed from office?
Once again, difficult to judge because it depends on market reactions. And now if the market's perception, right or wrong, if the market's perception is that that removal might be good for the economy, then markets will react. I'm speaking about currency markets, bond markets, equity markets. And if that's then a perceived good move, then maybe markets will receive that positively. But whether that improves our medium to longer term economic outlook, that's not sure, because we need economic reforms. That's not only dependent on a president. Economic reforms in terms of labor issues and government bureaucracy, and there's a whole bunch of that needs to be improved. So it wouldn't improve our economic growth outlook. It improves short-term confidence maybe, it impacts on markets maybe, but we still need economic reforms in terms of the economic outlook. We've seen this similar in terms of Brazil, that markets react before the time, markets react slightly further after the event, and then markets sit back and realize, hang on, that one single event doesn't improve the medium-term outlook. For that, we still need to do the hard work in terms of economic reforms.
And then looking at the consumer, Johan, we've all sustained this rise in prices in the cost of living, and many of us only see that in petrol pricing. Yet there is a factor called inflation as well. So many of us realize when we go and do the shopping that a year ago we spent 1,000 Rand on groceries, but a year down the line we're now spending 1,500 Rand on the same amount of groceries. And then also a year ago you spent X amount at the pumps to fill your car, maybe 500 Rand, and today it's costing you 800 Rand to fill your car. So could you possibly give us an indication of where the petrol price would be going and how this really fits into the inflationary spectrum in South Africa's economy?
On inflation, we can sit here a day and we won't cover all the topics, but I'll try and keep it short. But it's a very exciting and passionate subject, because all our individual inflation rates differ because we spend on different things. But on average, firstly, our inflation calculation in South Africa is top-notch. It's amongst the best in the world. In terms of petrol prices, that's of course the one thing that immediately impacts. It shows that immediate impact of the currency and the oil price coming through every month in terms of the petrol price. It's a fairly big weighting in the overall basket, so it impacts significantly. In terms of petrol though, I'm pretty sure that because my family and my friends argue with me, but I've got the numbers behind me, that the petrol price at the moment, as at today, is still R2.16 a litre lower than the high point in 2014. And I know it's volatile and I know it goes up and down. Just in the last 2 months, in beginning of August, beginning of September, we've seen a cut to the amount of R1.16 or R1.17 a litre. So at the moment, petrol price is R2.16 lower than what it was in 2014. We don't always realize that. In terms of other impacts on inflation, so we've had a significantly weaker currency over the last 4 years already, but we've had a fairly subdued impact on inflation. And the reason for that has been simply, and yes, I know prices have risen. I see it, my wife tells me, and she wants more money for the groceries. So it has happened. But compared to previous cycles when the rand weakened significantly, inflation has been fairly subdued. And the reason for that is that companies, businesses, retailers have been finding it difficult to pass on price increases to the consumer because the consumer spending environment is fairly weak. Consumers won't accept price increases, otherwise volumes come under pressure, and businesses have been taking it in their bottom line really. So that has helped quite a bit. The fact, in terms of food prices, there we've seen the biggest pressure because of the drought. But that's the one magic thing about inflation. I'll stop there. But if a 15 kilogram, I think it is, pocket of potatoes cost 100 rand, yes, even though prices have now fallen, that was very expensive. Yeah. But if it stays at 100 rand for a full year, next year this time, the inflation rate is 0% for potatoes. Yeah. And we don't always realize that. Inflation is calculated on a year-on-year percentage change basis. So there's some of those intricacies. Prices might still be extremely high, but a year later, the inflation rate for potatoes is 0. And that filters through the whole basket, of course. Now, I'm not taking away from the fact that inflation is bad for the consumer, but it's far more subdued than it was in 2008, 2009. And that, of course, impacts on interest rates.
You've been watching the Finance Forum, and our guest in studio was Mr. Johan Els, the senior economist for the Old Mutual Investment Group. And we say thank you to Johan for your presence here today.
Thank you very much.
And thank you for your enlightenment that you've given to our community and the consumer in general. Old Mutual Investment Group is an authorized financial services provider offering one of the oldest Islamic funds in South Africa, and that being the Old Mutual Al Baraka funds, Islamic funds. You can visit their website for further details. From the Finance Forum, you can follow us on Twitter, you can follow us on Facebook, you can join our channel on YouTube. And we encourage you to watch and learn from our guests that we have in studio. Till next week, you've been watching the Finance Forum. Stay focused to your finances.